Today, we conclude our Three Colors Kyurem trilogy with the original Kyurem itself. Even before it shocked the Pokemon world by becoming the first Pokemon to fuse with others, Kyurem was just as frightening as it was interesting. Kyurem is part of Gen 5's Tao trio, alongside Zekrom and Reshiram, who are well known to be based on Yin and Yang, but where does that leave Kyurem? As an empty shell born from the remains of the original dragon in black and white lore, Kyurem represents Wuji, or the absence of Yin and Yang, a fittingly icy concept. In-game, the residents of Lacunosa Town don't venture outside after dark, supposedly to protect themselves from being kidnapped and eaten by Kyurem. And finally, we know we made this reference in the Starmie remake video, but Kyurem is far more fitting for it. It's said to have arrived from space on a meteor, it thrives in the cold, it devours people and changes form. Kyurem is the Pokemon equivalent of the Thing. Today, we're going to examine if Kyurem was able to channel the power of Absolute Zero into the chillingly ruthless competitive scene. And so, we ask, how good was Kyurem actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Kyurem was imposing for reasons beyond the design upon Black and White's release. Gen 5 had released no shortage of beasts so powerful as to almost be unprecedented, and Kyurem, or Kyuremu, as its original Japanese name translated to, was right up there with them. It had the same special attack stat as Latios, and in addition to a powerful Draco meter that put the fear of Arceus in just about everything, its secondary stat was one of the best, most spammable offensive types in the game, Ice. This was particularly notable for slamming the most popular new Dragon resist, Ferrothorn, for neutral damage. Meanwhile, ice-resistant water types got utterly shelled by Draco Meteor. Kyurem also packed Focus Blast, ensuring that Heatran was far from safe as a counter. Furthermore, it was far from a glass cannon. With a solid base 90 defenses alongside an utterly mammoth base 125 HP, it took hits well even without any defensive investment. Sadly, for all its promise, Kyurem was also riddled with flaws, and major ones at that. That same ice typing, which provided it such incredible stab, also meant it had a lot of problems defensively. It wasn't all bad, as it became a dragon type with a neutrality to ice moves, which was valuable both in negating ice as a potential revenge killing tool against it, as well as accentuating its ability to act as a water resist. However, useful as these traits were, they were often not as impactful as the detriments brought about Kyurem's partial ice typing. The most instantly glaring was Stealth Rock, which limited both its natural hit-taking ability, especially in the ludicrously high-powered permanent weather nightmare that Gen 5 OU, and, more importantly, its ability to switch in and fire off its devastating attacks. This rock weakness extended to rock moves in addition to fighting and steel, as well as a dragon weakness on a Pokemon that, while not slow, was far from matching the screaming fast standards of pace set by Gen 5 OU. All this meant that revenge killing or even denying Kyurem a chance to do anything wasn't difficult at all. Thus, early on, Kyurem was overlooked and dropped to UU when the tier initially came out, though this did not last long at all. Kyurem absolutely massacred Gen 5 UU. It was pretty fast for the tier, and the tier was much weaker, so it got plenty of that which it struggled to find in OU, opportunity. Something you did not want to give something as earth-shatteringly powerful as Specs Kyurem. Its standard smashed everything short of Empoleon, Registeel, and Chansey, with the former two being utterly shellacked by Focus Blast. Not only was running Chansey on every team just to not immediately get smoked by Kyurem not reasonable, Chansey wasn't even guaranteed to stop Kyurem. First of all, Kyurem was often paired with Hail, which not only let it not miss an even stronger ice stab in the form of Blizzard, but also provided extra passive damage, which meant Chansey was even more hard-pressed to stave it off. Of course, Kyurem would have been obscenely overbearing even without Hail, as Hail just meant it went from impossible to stop to really impossible to stop. Second, Kyurem didn't have to run a spec set. Not only could it run a mixed life orb set, which blasted Chansey apart with Outrage, as many players forgot that, while Kyurem was primarily a special attacker, its base attack was equally outrageously high. Alternatively, it sometimes ran a substitute Hone Claw set, which set up 101 HP subs, meaning they weren't broken by Seismic Toss, and turned Chansey into complete setup fodder before proceeding to easily sweep Chansey's accompanying defensive team that couldn't much scratch it either with boosted Dragon Tails. Kyurem was genuinely unstoppable, the most broken Pokemon to ever set foot in Gen 5 UU. And bear in mind that eventual Uber Deoxys defense was a metagame mainstay as well. As such, Kyurem found itself banned almost instantly. Exiled from UU, Kyurem turned to OU and did attempt to find a niche there. Hail was the most niche of all weathers, but whenever a Hail team was used, used, Kyurem was a staple. At first, Scarf was the most popular, as it seemed the most intuitive answer, allowing Kyurem to turn the tables on faster offensive threats that would otherwise beat it one-on-one, instead being the one to threaten them out. However, the set that really took off was Substitute, Blizzard, Dragon Pulse, and Focus Blast. While not as instantly threatening against faster teams, Kyurem could delegate that to its teammates while focusing on this new variant's fierce wall-breaking ability. Freed from the restraints of Choice Lock, bolstered further by Substitute status protection and ease of prediction, with leftovers as passive recovery or neutering of Sandstorm damage, which helped even more. Kyurem's ability to threaten just about every team was a Hail team's best tool for winning the Weather War. It would scatter so much significant damage around sand and rain, including but certainly not limited to Tyranitar and Politoed, that they'd scramble to pick up the pieces. Some teams were immensely threatened as well, but Kyurem was niche in the grand scheme of things because Hail teams, for all their advantages, were quite specific and flawed. That tends to happen when you have two ice types on a team. However, the fact that they were legitimate at all in Black and White was largely thanks to Kyurem. Black and White 2 came around and Kyurem received several immense upgrades. And no, not just its two alternate forms. Kyurem absolutely loved the addition of the recovery option of Roost and the Heatran and Jirachi smacking Earth Power to its move pool. Kyurem's new standard set became Sub-Roost Earth Power and Blizzard, or Ice Beam, because Kyurem was starting to find use outside of the Hail teams that were becoming increasingly niche and borderline obsolete in the wake of Black and White 2's obscene power creep. It was particularly valuable on rain, as Substitute Roost Kyurem specialized in slicing through bulky sand teams, helping level an otherwise disadvantageous matchup. Black Kyurem famously dropped from Ubers to OU not long after Black and White 2's release. Was that the end of Kyurem's time in OU? Far from it. Sure, if you wanted a choice bander or a substitute mixed attacker, you went with Black Kyurem and its unholy attack stat. However, if you wanted your substitute Kyurem to be a special attacker only and run Roost as well, then base Kyurem was absolutely the correct choice. First, base Kyurem had much higher special attack than Black Kyurem, letting it dish out damage far more easily, an advantage especially important when trying to break through the likes of Tyranitar and Jirachi. However, unlike Black Kyurem, base Kyurem also had the pressure ability, which allowed it to quickly PP stall Gyro Ball from Ferrothorn or Fortress, thus invalidating a would-be check with far greater ease. Sure, base Kyurem didn't have Terravolt to hit Rotom Wash with Earth Power, but Rotom Wash was dominated one-on-one anyway, so it hardly mattered. Yes, Black Kyurem gave base Kyurem competition and was overall used more because of how easy it was to slap Choice Band on Dragmag teams, but so too did base Kyurem give Black Kyurem competition. It was hardly a mismatch. Kyurem became popular as one of the main forces helping Rain remain viable in the face of sand balance dominance. However, it started to fall out of the metagame when such sand teams adopted a playstyle which made it nearly impossible for Kyurem's partner Tentacruel to spin. And Kyurem couldn't do much wall breaking when it was getting ravaged by hazards. Thus, it disappeared for a while. But when Excadrill found its way back into the tier, so too did Kyurem gain new life. This time around, it didn't bother with Sub-Roost. It went for the jugular with Choice Specs, boasting the strongest Draco Meteor in the tier, since it, unlike Latios, could afford to run Modest. Power wasn't the only reason Kyurem was a solid Specs user either. Its lack of a pursuit weakness meant it wouldn't be limited to one KO by Tyranitar. This trait also made it much more reliable at absorbing Spore from Amoonguss with Sleep Talk. Furthermore, many opposing sand teams struggled to withstand its powerful ice beams, making it even easier for Kyurem to dish out. So overall, Kyurem had an intriguing debut generation, from its early days shell-shock in UU to the various niches it occupied in OU. Generation 6 brought many changes to irritate Kyurem. Draco Meteor and Ice Beam were weakened, while Draco Meteor hadn't just gained the resistance, but an immunity with the addition of fairy types. However, Kyurem also possessed the excellent trait of being a dragon type with a secondary stab that threatened fairy types, and it loved the buff to defog, making it easier to keep hazards off the field. It did compete with Black Kyurem once again, and KB was easier to slap on a team in those early days with its huge attack and access to Fusion Bolt, making it a significant difference, notably in ensuring Azumarill, which could take both of its stabs, couldn't check it. Thus, Kyurem dropped to UU. There, for all its strengths, it had an unfortunate tendency to live in the shadow of Hydreigon, one of the best Pokemon in the tier, and one much easier to slap on a team and use in-game thanks to its higher speed, Stealth Rock neutrality, and immunity to spikes and Earthquake. Still, Kyurem maintained a legitimate niche in the tier, as the biting chill of its Specs Ice Beam was something Hydreigon wished it could replicate, as ripping through Florges with a stab move was incredible and formed the crux of Kyurem's niche through X and Y UU. Come Oraz, however, the tier got much faster and stronger with the addition of monsters like Salamence and new megas like Sceptile, so Kyurem could take a back seat and found itself in RU for about a week. It was obvious Kyurem would be trouble in RU from day one, given how huge its 660 base stat total so utterly dwarfed everything else, but even still, it was a wonder to behold just how brutally it shattered the tier. It wasn't just with choice specs either, although that was hilarious in how it effortlessly shredded everything around it. It picked the other Pokemon in the metagame off so quickly and easily, it was like someone had let Rayquaza loose in the tier. No, Kyurem was amazing not just because of its overbearing power, but because of the incredible variety in utilizing that power. Scarf sets tore through offense, while mixed and 3 attacks roost sets were similar to specs in their wall-breaking ferocity. But Kyurem could also pull off not just 1, but 2 sub-roost sets. One offensive, one defensive, with the defensive one still hitting hard despite its bulkier inclination thanks to its incredible natural offenses, and in fact being more difficult to deal with since it took hits absurdly well once it invested in that titanic bulk. Kyurem was absolutely overbearing and received a quick unanimous ban. Kyurem never quite pulled itself from RU-BL status. Its spec set still had its place in UU, especially as the tier banned the more powerful threats, and Kyurem was more able to keep up with the metagame's pace. But it remained niche not because it was bad, it really wasn't, but because Hydreigon was almost always the better choice. Kyurem's Ice Beam tearing apart the tier's de facto Dragon Check, Florges, was a legitimate niche, though just one that was difficult to fit. In a similar vein, Kyurem actually found its spec set occupying a niche in OU, something that Black Kyurem could not replicate. Spec's Ice Beam was a similarly brutal offensive weapon, as it not only threatened bulky tier staples like Gliscor and Skarmory, but cleanly powered through their common partner Clefable, and it did so by spamming its stab, not needing the prediction or Life Orb recoil that mixed Black Kyurem so suffered from. Balanced teams which preferred to control the pace of the game until they could unleash a nasty wall breaker loved using Spec's Kyurem in this slot, especially since its natural bulk helped withstand hits from Pokemon like Manaphy and Superior. It was a specific niche, but a genuine one, and funnily enough, Kyurem was arguably better in OU than in UU. So overall, Kyurem had its ups and downs in Gen 6, but its campaign was a successful one. In the wake of good old power creep, Generation 7 saw Kyurem unceremoniously slip past OU and UU alike, landing in RU. There it once again ceremoniously performed an over-the-top rampage of destruction on the tier. Who could have expected that the monstrous base stat total in conjunction with vicious specs and sub-roost sets would so effectively pummel the inhabitants of a tier below UU? Well, to nobody's surprise, Kyurem did just that, and was once again banned about a week into RU's existence. That was a pleasant repeat of its past. A less pleasant repeat was the fact that it struggled to leave a significant impact on UU because Hydreigon existed. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Latias was now around and similarly elite as well. Kyurem's greatest niche in UU was when Gliscor was in the tier, as it was unique amongst its dragon competition and how it could always threaten a cold one-hit KO on it, even without the help of Z-moves. Even after Gliscor left, Kyurem retained several interesting niches, mostly in how it could defeat Blissey far better than Hydreigon and Latias could. For example, its Mammoth attack stat lent itself well to using Z Outrage, turning into an effective lure capable of opening the floodgates for its specially offensive teammates, while even its classic sub-roost set could pressure stall Bliss quite well. The problem was that Kyurem's defensive typing was just so much worse than its counterparts, and thus slotting it on a team was quite difficult. Plus, if you really wanted Ice-type offense, you could use the Stealth Rock neutral Mamoswine, who was incredibly difficult to wall as a whole. Kyurem was still a decent UU Pokemon, just one whose niche was limited due to its competition. Funnily enough, Kyurem was also once again arguably better in OU than in UU. Its competition with Black Kyurem continued, especially since KB was now tearing through the tier with ICM Z boosted freeze shocks. But once again, base Kyurem established itself as a major, distinct threat in its own right, in ways that Black Kyurem couldn't hope to match, let alone outclass, with its sub-roost set. Sure, Black Kyurem could also use substitute or roost, but certainly not together on one set, lest it impede its coverage too greatly. Base Kyurem equipped with just Ice Beam and Earth Power did not possess such a hindrance, and was thus able to protect itself from status and keep itself healthy over the course of the game, while still dishing out a brutal offensive assault. Just like in Gen 5, pressure was valuable for stalling out Ferrothorn's Gyro Balls too. Kyurem got so many opportunities against the defensive staples of the tier, notably waters like Toxapex and Rotom Wash, grasses like Tangrowth and Tapu Bulu, and others like Gliscor and Tornadus Therian, while also threatening out the likes of Heatran, Superior, and Zapdos. Its go-to item at first was Metronome, whose increasing power with repeated use of a move allowed its Ice Beams to blast through Clefable and its earth powers to slam Maikiri and Toxapex. However, ICMZ was also a superb choice, with the extra burst of damage helping it overwhelm the likes of Celesteela, whilst letting Kyurem switch into Pokemon like Tangrowth and Tornadus without fearing losing its items to their knockoff. ICMZ became especially preferred once it was discovered that Metronome's power increase was reset by Protect, though Metronome was still useful to ensure Peck struggled against Kyurem more than it already did. As such, Kyurem established itself as a legitimate, terrifying threat in Gen 7 OU. In the early days of post-Dynamax Sword and Shield OU, where the Pokedex was limited, Specs Kyurem established itself as one of the metagame's premier threats. Its newfound access to Freeze Dry made it even more terrifying, as it now had a variant on its Ice Stab that also hit water super effectively, making it even more difficult to check. Kyurem also gained two other amazing moves, Dragon Dance and Icicle Spear, and new ways of using it began to form. Finally, it could make use of that monstrous attack stat it had. It wasn't going to be your standard DD sweeper though. No, it was something much nastier. It was to be a Dragon Dance sweeper that maximized its huge bulk and access to pressure to stall out the opponent's limited responses to it and accrue multiple Dragon Dances. Early variants began popping up with Substitute, Dragon Dance, Icicle Spear, and usually Roost, but occasionally Protect holding leftovers or heavy duty boosts to finally ignore its long-standing enemy, Stealth Rock. These sets were utter terrors, as Ice was one of the best mono-attacking coverage types in the game, especially in conjunction with Kyurem's huge attack and bulk, letting it grab multiple Dragon Dances easily, alongside a set designed to squeeze as much value out of pressure as possible. You think you were fine with Clefable's Moonblast against it, until suddenly you had lost nearly all of your PP, and even if you did manage to connect with Kyurem when it didn't have a sub up, it would devour the hit, gain health back, and sweep you with boosted Icicle Spears. Sitting on Kyurem with Toxapex wouldn't work either, as its hazes got pressure stalled too, so eventually it'd run out, and Kyurem would Dragon Dance several times and win. It was absolutely nightmarish to face and swept many a team. Now, as obscene and terrifying as Specs and sub Dragon Dance Kyurem were, they were eventually overshadowed before they could really pose a problem for OU when the Isle of Armor came about, bringing with it the monstrously broken threats like Cinderace, Maikiri, and Urshifu, at least initially. As a result, Kyurem dropped to UU. There it was utterly monstrous, finding plenty of opportunity against the tier's lower power and speed level to switch in and wreak havoc. Specs was the most immediately dangerous threat, as quite literally nothing switched into it safely. But Subroost had become even more vicious since its coverage had improved with Freeze Dry as its Ice Stab instead of Ice Beam, letting it smack water super effectively as well. Many players considered Kyurem to be on the cusp of being too much for UU, only held back by its lower speed in comparison to other wall breakers like Terrakion and Keldeo. However, they didn't need to ban it, because after OU banned the likes of Cinderace and Maikiri, Kyurem's viability in the tier shot way up. Its specs and subsets were so good and saw so much usage that Kyurem rose out of UU naturally. Then came the Crown Tundra, and in addition to the vastly expanded Pokedex, Cinderace and Maikiri returned. The domino effect of this power creep meant Kyurem not only wasn't part of the initial wave of OU, it also fell past UU and landed in RU, where for the third generation in a row, it was banned almost instantly. Specs and Subroost were even more horrifying for the hapless RU tier to face with Freeze Dry now in Kyurem's arsenal, to say nothing of its newfound capacity for sweeping with Dragon Dance. Thus, Kyurem returned to trying to find a niche in UU, but it didn't have to try hard, for it had merely been overlooked at the start of the tier. Once players remembered it existed, they were all too happy to slash through the metagame with its vicious Subroost special attacking set, Specs Ice Beams, or occasional Dragon Dance antics. Generally, it didn't matter if you knew what set Kyurem was, because it was so threatening with its sheer power, but it certainly didn't help to not know what set it was, especially since even if it used sub, you still wouldn't know if it was a special attacker or a DD necessarily. And it was difficult to safely check multiple Kyurem variants with one Pokemon. For example, Chansey could withstand special attacking sets, but was complete setup fodder for the sub DD variant. Eventually, Kyurem once again left UU, rising to OU by usage, but it wasn't just good this time. Players began to realize how genuinely overwhelming it was. A new set had emerged that had established Kyurem's place as a vicious wall breaker, as by using Never Melt Ice as its item, Kyurem could, unlike the Spec set, remain flexible in its attacking to fully abuse the strength of a boosted Ice Beam and the water crushing of Freeze Dry, while being able to safely threaten the likes of Heatran with Earth Power or remain healthy with Roost, or if it wanted to become a truly really vicious all-out wall breaker. It could slot Icicle Spear over Roost, taking advantage of the Never Melt Ice boost to put immense pressure on the likes of Blissey and Galarian Slowking. This level of variety in a set to invalidate the few checks it had was a huge part of what made Kyurem so threatening, but that was just the tip of the Never Melt Iceberg. While that set was ferocious, sub DD Kyurem could completely take over a game very quickly, especially if the opponent didn't expect it. It was so good at PP stalling, it even consistently beat Heatran of all things, by eventually setting up enough Dragon Dances to where it could break through it with quadruple resisted Icicle Spears. That's still not even close to all Kyurem could do. Its sub-roost set returned, rocking either boots or leftovers, and with the potential for different EV spreads, it could go all out with offensive investment, or it could effectively wield the same type of heavy special defense EVs that made its sub DD set so frightening, letting it PP stall Clefable's Moonblast and thus making its sub even more difficult to check, while still hitting hard thanks to its naturally huge special attack. This set's incredible longevity allowed Kyurem to utilize one of its most annoying talents, the many opportunities it got to fish for a freeze. 10% over the course of one turn is quite low, and the odds don't improve that much over the course of just a few turns, but they begin getting dangerously high quite quickly, and Freeze Drive's massive 32 PP count meant Kyurem got plenty of opportunity to score just one freeze, which had a nasty tendency to be game breaking. Simply using 3 Ice Beams or Freeze Drives already gives you a 27% chance to score one freeze between them. Half the time, Kyurem wasn't even exactly trying for freezes either. They were just a byproduct of it attempting to deal damage with stab. The Never Melt Ice variant was arguably even scarier in that regard, since it packed Ice Beam in addition to Freeze Dry, meaning it had a whopping total of 48 PP with freeze potential. Players were using a lot of Volcarona to try and check these Kyurem variants, and it did pretty well. Oh, the Kyurem is Specs and Dracometer Vulcan to dust. Never mind. Yeah, Specs Kyurem was also as vicious as ever, with its raw power often overwhelming even resists like Melmetal. Now, Kyurem utterly dominated the balanced part of the metagame that was largely characteristic of OU, but at least faster offensive teams had an easier time denying its opportunities, right? Yeah, until Scarf Kyurem appeared and absolutely destroyed the Dragapult that thought it would beat it one-on-one, while also becoming an excellent late-game cleaner in its own right. This incredible variety in such powerful sets made facing Kyurem unbearable. Not knowing what it do was bad enough, then even when you knew what it would do, it still had the nasty habit of beating you through sheer power or bulk or even freezes. Though rare, it could even go with wilder options like with Weakness Policy Dragon Dance, easily soaking up one super effective hit for an extra +2 attack and proceeding to sweep. It could pretty much pick and choose which checks it could invalidate with alarming ease between its incredible move pool, power, bulk, and capacity to freeze. Kyurem was legitimately consistent at scoring freezes, a tactic which hadn't been seen to this extent since Gen 1 OU. The player base was split on its impact, but eventually a test was held and Kyurem was just barely voted to be too much for OU, finally joining its other 2 forms in Ubers. And Kyurem wasn't worth much in the actual Ubers metagame itself, since its 2 forms outclassed it on the respective sides of the attacking spectrum. Kyurem's one niche lies in PP stalling with pressure, but this was generally not consistent and it was just about never used. But then again, who cares? Kyurem had just had its most successful generation of all time by a long shot. And that's it. So how good was Kyurem actually? Well, it's had quite an interesting career. It's always had solid roles in OU, but was never a true OU Pokemon. Though ironically, it tended to be better in OU than in UU, since UU it had to contend with Hydreigon, with the exception of its Gen 5 debut, of course, where Kyurem was far from the most vicious Pokemon to ever exist in the tier. Since Kyurem was on the rarer side in UU, it also found itself dropping to RU repeatedly, but legitimately every single time Kyurem landed in RU, it got banned immediately, achieving the feat in Gen 6, 7, and 8. In Gen 8, it also rose out of usage in UU to become OU twice, and the second time around, it was so overwhelmingly monstrous that it eventually became Uber in its own right. So all in all, Kyurem has had an incredibly successful competitive career, with many a Specs Dracometer and Ice Beam KO or sub-roost stall that left the opponent baffled at how to stop it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Kyurem? What would you give it to have something over its other 2 forms? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow Maikiri on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.